Good afternoon. My name is Candace and I'm an event manager. On behalf of Town Hall Seattle and our friends at Third Place Books, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's virtual presentation with Ece Temelkuran and Nesrine Malik as part of our Civic series. As we get underway, I would like to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continued use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. Thank you for tuning in. Town Hall is proud to be a community-focused organization and a place where we can share and sustain ideas and creativity, even if it means we can't gather in person. I'd like to thank Ece and Nesrine for appearing to make that possible. If you share in Town Hall's vision for a robust community engaged in the arts, science, and culture where everyone has a voice, please consider donating or becoming a member. Town Hall is adding new programs every day, and you can check out more of what's upcoming by visiting our online calendar at townhallseattle.org. Today's conversation will be about an hour, including Q&A. Questions will be selected from those in the chat field at the bottom of the video player, so please submit those at any time. You can also text questions to 206-504-2857 as noted in the chat. We can't guarantee that we'll get to every question, but we'll get to as many as possible. Please keep your questions concise and in the form of a question. For those who would like to view the program with closed captions, you can click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player, and the program will be available for re-watching immediately following the event. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Civic series is supported by Real Networks Foundation, True Brown Foundation, KUOW, the Norcliffe Foundation, and the Wyncote Foundation Northwest. And finally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, so I want to thank all the members watching. One final note, if you're interested in purchasing copies of the books being discussed today, please use the links in the chat below to buy through our partner bookseller, Third Place Books, as well as Bookshop. And now for today's program. With all the political tumult over the last year plus in the US and around the world, one thing is clear. There is still progress to be made for equality in our society. Our speakers today invite us to examine some of the myths that are distracting us from that progress, how to identify them, and how to build a better world. Nesrine Malik is an award-winning British Sudanese columnist and features writer for The Guardian. She was named Society and Diversity Commentator of the Year at the 2017 Comment Awards. She was also longlisted for the Orwell Prize for exposing Britain's social evils in 2019 and the Orwell Prize for Journalism just this year. Nesrine is joining us today from Nairobi. Ece Temelkuran is one of Turkey's best-known novelists and political commentators. Her journalism has appeared in The Guardian, The New York Times, and New Statesman, among others. She's the author of the book How to Lose a Country, The 7 Steps from Democracy to Dictatorship, which was published in 2019. Ece is joining us today from Croatia. Both speakers today have new books coming out already. Together, 10 Choices for a Better Now is Ece's latest work, and Nesrine's is We Need New Stories, The Myths That Subvert Freedom. They'll be drawing on both of these works today in their conversation. Please join me in welcoming Nesrine Malik and Ece Temelkuran.
Thank you, Candace.
Thank you, Candace. Very excited to be here.
Me too. Hi, Nesrine. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
I'm fine. It's 12 o'clock at Nairobi, midnight, right?
Yes, it's fine.
11 o'clock here.
I am alert via the fumes of being here with you. So
me too. It's like this is our late night show. So
exactly. Thank you for joining us.
So I have your book here. We Need New Stories. Unfortunately, It's in printout because the publisher sent me an ebook, so I printed out. It's not the actual book. It's a very gray.
Don't worry, everyone. That's not what you'll get when you buy the book.
So, The Myths That Subvert Freedom. I loved your book. It is super precise and super clear, and it's like a dragger, or not. Actually, it's like what is that? It's like a very thin sword. Yeah, it goes right to the heart. So thank you for writing this.
I'll see if I can get that as a pull quote on the jacket. Like
oh yeah, of course, why not? So Yeah, shall we start?
We shall. I think just maybe a brief background as to how we both came to these books. I think one thing that's been really striking in reading your book is just how much, and I hate this phrase because it sounds just kind of like a generic book chat phrase, but the books really are in conversation quite a lot of the time.
Absolutely is. I felt like hearing you and talking to you when I was, reading your book, having written together.
Yeah, and it felt like it felt both comforting to know that somebody else was thinking about these things, but also for me a little bit humbling, because I felt like my approach compared to yours, or at least my style compared to yours, seemed just like very clinical, and you're just incredibly lyrical and warm in your writing. And I felt like I had come to it with a sort of almost street analysis approach, and you came to it from the heart. And that's where I felt the books were in conversation. Do you know what I mean? Especially the bit about,
absolutely.
Especially the bit where you say like this was your attempt at hope. And
no,
for me,
well, actually, I agree and disagree, because when I was reading your book, I thought, this is from the heart. It doesn't have to be lyrical when something is from the heart. It is from under your skin. I'm like, so it's analysis. It's a lot of people talking in the book, which was amazing, and I learned a lot, by the way. I thought that I knew about political correctness and the history of it. And I learned a lot on the second chapter, the myth of a political correctness crisis. And also the myth of harmful identity politics. That's the fourth chapter in your book. I thought I knew, but there were things that I didn't. So thank you for writing that. And it doesn't have to be lyrical when something is from the heart. I think we are expected to write from the heart because we are women, or it has to be lyrical because we are women. But when it's analytical, it is still from the heart. And people might not think that way, but I can feel this is something very personal to you, what you have written about.
Yeah, it is. It is. And it felt quite, this is why reading your book was such a delight, because it felt like quite a lonely process writing this book at the time. And this is maybe, if you give us maybe a brief background to, because I think then we'll really see the synergies. Like when you wrote together 10 Choices for a Better Now, that was sort of the second part of a longer process that you were going through. Right?
Yeah. I wrote How to Lose a Country, 7 Steps from Democracy to Dictatorship in 2019. And it was published in several languages. So I went around the world talking about rising fascism and how rising right-wing populism is a global matter because it is embedded in neoliberal politics and so on and so forth. And that no country is immune to this malaise of our times. While talking to people, it occurred to me that actually there's something else that I have to talk about. Because after every talk that I gave about how to lose a country, there was one person in every audience, in every country, asking the same question. So where's the hope? Because it seems like a hopeless time for several reasons on several levels. So I thought I had to deal with this question, although the question annoyed me at the time a lot, so much so that I was trying to, write a restaurant hope menu for people, like, here's your hope, kind of served warmly and so on, served with love. But then I thought
someone approached you and reproached you for being annoyed at that question, no?
Yeah. Elderly lady, let's say, approached me, and there was a cross hanging from her neck, and she said, they're asking for something else. Don't be angry with this question about the hope. They're asking for something else. They're asking about faith. And when of course, after I saw the cross hanging, I thought she was talking about religion, and I thought, I'm not a religious person. And she said, I'm not talking about that. So I started thinking about faith and how much we have left in humankind, because we are in a horrible time. We are going through a horrible time because the system is collapsing and the new system is not born yet. So as Gramsci said once, we are going through all the morbid symptoms possible. So it is only normal that we are in the age of anxieties and so on. So we need to have faith, not hope, maybe. But then you are analyzing that the period we're living in, these morbid symptoms, in a way that it's as if, you know why I thought your book is actually emotional? Because there is a voice there, you know, catching the reader from the colors and asking, do you understand this? Okay, this is the real situation. This is the myth and this is the reality. So why did you write the book? Actually, I'm like, this is what I feel, but why did you write it?
Yeah, so I guess it was for the same reason that you did, but I didn't know it at the time. So if you came together because you kind of wrote about creeping fascism and then thought, no, but we do have a choice and we can ameliorate these things. I was just taken, I remember when I first started writing or thinking about it, I was just taken with how much was going on that no one was talking about. You know that movie Shutter Island, where you're just, it felt like that. I was like, okay, so sure, we've got, you know, Brexit and Trump and right-wing parties rising across the world, and we've got this sort of stasis of neoliberal distress, but we are focused too much on these manifestations, and we're focused almost too much on the polarity of it. So it was like left versus right, Republican versus Democrat, you know, socialist versus conservative. And I just was so aware of the fact, or so taken by the fact, that it was more about the center versus the peripheries, or the sort of the top of the pyramid versus the bottom of the pyramid, or the winners versus the losers. Like in my mind, what was happening was a sort of culmination of years and years and years of the hoarding of freedom, basically, at the center of society by very small groups of people. And the way they do that is via these myths, right? And these myths keep us stuck thinking, you know, if only Trump would go away, you know what I mean? Or, you know, if only, for example, you know, we managed to get rid of the filibuster, or like all these little silver bullets and large silver bullets that people always think are going to be the sort of final stage, especially in the case of America. It's always on the cusp of this like massive episode of freedom, right? While actually in the meantime, things are pretty dire. So I wanted to move away from this fixation on personalities, heads of state, election results, even things like, you know, QAnon, conspiracy theories, all these things, to me, were all manifestations of things that have been happening for decades and decades, which are propagated by very small, very powerful, sometimes very clearly corporate interests. As in the case of political correctness, like one thing people would be surprised to find out, and I certainly was shocked to find out, that political correctness was manufactured. Like the fight against political correctness was manufactured. It was funded very heavily from the 70s onwards by think tanks, funded by right-wing corporates who didn't want political correctness as a concept to catch on. Anyway, so I just felt like, I guess, and this is where I feel we're quite similar, because I'm not from the West, because I grew up in dictatorships. I think people grow up in dictatorships, they're very clear-eyed about things. They're not confused by, you know, all these liberal norms, you know, or these very high expectations of how people behave.
Well, I have to ask you here a question. Yeah. You said that like we lived in dictatorships, which is correct. I think we're clear-eyed, but do they believe in us? because you're talking about United States, and I'm talking about all the countries that are not mine. And I'm telling them, okay, this is going to happen to you. Actually, now it's happening to you. You don't see it. Hey, come on, you know, chap, and so on. How does it feel for you? Or tell me stories about this. I'm sure you have stories about this. How do they react when you tell their story to them? I'm talking about the Western countries, especially United States, Britain, and so on.
That's such a good question. So my book opens on the myth of the reliable narrator, which is sort of my attempt as someone on the inside, as a journalist in a international liberal left-wing newspaper, The Guardian, to try and shed some light on how the sort of narrator class or the media class pretends that it is unbiased and sort of very, very sort of absolved from human prejudice. And that's not been my experience at all, actually, for a bunch of reasons. Like the media class in the US and the UK is overwhelmingly white. It's overwhelmingly middle and upper class. It's
and you give quite good numbers in the book about that.
I mean, the numbers are staggering. You know, they're more. You know, there are a couple of numbers that suggest that the media class in the US and the UK is more privileged than the elite in general. So it's a sort of super elite at the top, and by definition, if you're a super elite and you're supposed to be explaining and covering the world to people, your perspective on that world is very limited. And so my experience has been, again, I just kind of walked in and I was like, why are we not talking about this? Like, why are we not talking about the fact that I am the only person of color on this team, or I'm the only person who didn't go to, you know, an Ivy League, Cambridge. Exactly. But because it's sort of the default, people just think, oh, but you have been granted entry into this hallowed space, as opposed to this hallowed space is by definition, because it's hallowed, doesn't mean it means it's not working. You see what I mean? And so, yeah, so in answer to your question, the response has been interesting. It ranges from like extremely hostile. So people just saying like, you know, what do you know? You know, you're not from this country, or you haven't had these, because you don't understand the subtleties of class. It's all about subtlety. You don't grasp the subtlety.
Oh yeah, subtlety. Yeah.
It's a trigger word for me now. Or there's this kind of assumption that we have brought you in and you're being ungrateful by pointing out, you know, our foibles. But on the other hand, the reception has also been from outside the media. The reception has been extremely grateful in some quarters, because I think many people feel very disconnected from, especially the big mainstream media organizations. They don't understand why, and they feel let down by them. And there's very few people that actually talk about what it's like on the inside. And this is what my entire first chapter is about, like how people make decisions when they mess up. How do they fail to apologize? How do we not make changes? This kind of culture of impunity that there is in the media. And I found that on the consumer side, people are incredibly grateful because they feel the same. They're like, okay, so I'm not going mad. So, you know, there is this sense of false balance and false equivalence. There is this like huge indulgence of Trump, for example, before he became president. Mm-hmm. But it's a tense thing because I'm kind of still in the media, so it's sort of like being a whistleblower.
You should be careful about what you
it's like being a whistleblower, but openly and still having your job.
I had this experience, and I wonder you had a similar one. You're coming from Sudan, although you were already a young adult when you started living in the Western countries, in Western world and so on. But I came to Zagreb and I started writing in English in 2016, which makes me like what? I was 43 when I started writing in English. And then Turkey is going through some hard shit, whatever. Everybody knows about it now. And I'm here for political reasons, obviously. So the Western countries, whenever wherever I went and wherever I spoke, it's the same attitude. It's like, okay, tell me your story, like how you suffered and what can I do for you? Actually, this is the beginning of How to Lose a Country. What can I do for you? And, you know, I always feel like a, you know, baby panda being adopted via website. So, and instead, I'm not telling them my story and how I suffered, how this intellectual white woman, sort of white woman, you know, threw herself to the arms of civilization in Europe. But I tell them their story and how actually they are suffering from fascism. And this doesn't feel good to them. And the first response and the first reaction actually is what you said. Are you good enough to write this book? Let's, you know, make an exam. And this is happening in, you know, public talks and public book events and so on. And almost always by white established men. So they do not want to hear their story, I think, from the other. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a bunch of things at the same time. I think it's very unusual that women talk about this stuff in general. I think that men tend to be vested with authority when it comes to talking about politics. And with women, if it's not like you talking about politics via a very personal story, then people don't really find that credible. So I think the gender thing is an issue. I think also, and this is something I have found mostly within very kind of blue chip, shall we say, media organizations, that everything needs to be balanced. Everything needs to be expressed with this sort of academic composure. If you use strong words, or if you use words like fascism, or if you use words like myth, if you use words like unreliable narrator, they're like, oh God, here's like a hysterical person. This is not how we talk about the world. And that's what I found the most insidious bit about, particularly the US media, particularly in places like the New York Times, where everything has to be expressed in almost a lawyerly way, which is a function of like the elite nature of these spaces, right? But like, we are in a political crisis. You know, you have to call things what they are. And I think that the sort of commentary or analysis that comes from the East, that comes particularly from women from the East, who bring to it, you know, anger and passion and testimony, is just seen as sort of amateur and hysterical and not sensible or composed enough. But how can
passionate?
How can you be composed?
The worst adjective in Britain, I learned this by experience, is passionate and interesting as well. Interesting is another one.
Passionate means that people don't need to take you seriously because you've got feeling.
You think, you know, we spoke with you earlier, and you said that mine is an angry book. Am I right? No, you said negative, and then you said angry. Are you angry?
You know what? I'm so angry to the extent that when I was reading your chapter on letting go of anger, I thought, you know, I really need this actually, because it's reached a level. It's reached a level of not frustration, but sort of jaundice almost, you know, because I think if maybe it's the same for everyone, but particularly if you're a journalist, and if you're a journalist broadly on the left, and you are interested in social equity, in racial equality, in gender equality, and economic equality, the pandemic year has been extremely difficult because you just see every day in, day out, human beings reduced to subhuman status, right? Either via poverty, via sort of extractiveness from employers. We've had two governments in the US and the UK that have made a mockery and actually rolled back gender equality laws and racial equality laws. And if you're kind of looking at the whole picture, if you're not just looking at, you know, gender or race or class, then every day you wake up, it's just an inferno. right? Because you just think there's so much that is being rolled back, and there's so much that is being sort of destroyed. But but as you say in your book, there's lots of little things, especially since the pandemic started, of like little spontaneous community movements. And the danger with being angry, I find, the danger with kind of focusing on these things all the time is that you do lose the small picture. You see what I'm saying? If you focus on the big picture too much, people always say, oh, you missed the big picture. Actually, missing the small picture is just as bad.
Brilliant point. Absolutely.
And so if you can talk about that a little bit, just to kind of fumigate my anger, that would be great.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure if I said let go of anger, but it was more like replace it with attention. And this is what you do. Actually, you refine your anger during the analysis you make. And then, you, of course, you pay attention, utmost attention to what's happening and seeing the big and the little picture, whatever. And you are keeping your anger in a sustainable way. My problem with anger, in today's anger, is that it is commodified, and the extreme, the inflation of expression of anger. That's my problem. And people are, the illusion that people are going through while they're expressing anger, they think of themselves as politically engaging, which is not correct. History doesn't care about what we feel or how angry we are. It cares about what we do, actually. So, and since words are events, since words people make people do things, I think you are, channeling your anger, your refined anger, in the most brilliant, divine way.
Well, I have a couple of quotes I've taken down that actually apply from your, actually I've taken down a bunch of quotes, but apply to the point of testimony and the point of anger. So you say, and this says it more succinctly than I did an entire chapter, which is words had to be kept neutral in the power struggle between the oppressed and the oppressor. And I think that creates anger, right? When you can't, when you're always flattening your expression, you're always blunting the edges, you're always trying to call things, it's like this whole thing of finding euphemisms for racism. So calling things, calling people provocateurs, or calling people, controversial, or calling people, saying things are racially charged. All this neutralization of language, I think, creates a lot of anger, because you're just not channeling it, you're not calling things what they are. The second thing I took down is, among the emotions, anger is the most engaging and by far the most profitable. And I think one thing we do miss quite a lot, and one thing that I'm certainly guilty of, is that because we see a lot of anger in our social media and on our TVs, and everything is a debate, everything is a debate now, and everything is a kind of flammable debate, we assume that the kind of grand sum of anger in the world has gone up, when actually something different is happening, which is it's being stoked. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, like, when the anger is banal, there's no use of anger in terms of politics, as far as I observe. And debate, making everything a debate, is the most diminishing thing ever, because you make everything into a binary situation, like, either this or that. So there's no gray area. We're living in a world where anger is, something that companies, social media companies, are making profit of. What I'm thinking, what I was worrying about was actually anger was a political tool. In terms of emotions, it was a very strong political emotion, and then we don't have it now because it's commodified. So what can we have which cannot be commodified? And I thought attention is that thing, because there's a tradition of thinkers thinking and talking about this attention. How can we be attentive, and how can attention turn into political activity? This was my question. Yeah, but in terms of neutrality and objectivity,
Mm.
you're a journalist. I've been a journalist before they fired me because of my columns. And I noticed this happening during the 90s, actually, this objectivity and the myth, like in your terms, myth of objectivity. And you put it incredibly well in this reliable narrator myth. I remember it's happening, actually, because we have to be objective. We have to do both sides of the story and so on and so forth. And now we are seeing it in the Gaza situation as well. There's a massacre and they're still both siding the situation and they're calling it a conflict, which is a good example of your neutral language. I think after 80s on, during 90s and so on, we replaced objectivity with neutrality, and we started calling neutrality objectivity. And objectivity, when all good cards on the other side, is not very objective. It is actually supporting the power, and this has been happening since such a long time that we now think it's the natural state of media. It's the natural state of journalism.
Yeah, and I mean, this is something I touch on in chapter 5, I think. I don't even know the chapter I'm about. The myth of the free speech crisis. We are told that there is this myth. We're told that there is this crisis of free speech all the time. Yeah. This is like a conversation that has been happening now for 4 or 5 years, and everything is now a free speech crisis, right? So if you object to someone saying something online, then you're censoring them. Like, we've just completely lost control of what free speech is. But the free speech crisis, which is this assumption that any response to someone's speech is you trying to shut them down or you trying to censor them, as opposed to you exercising your own free speech rights. This framing is a function of this neutralization, right? It's a function of this assumption that all ideas are the same in a marketplace of ideas, and the good ideas rise to the top and the bad ideas drop to the bottom. And the problem with this assumption of this like laissez-faire, free functioning marketplace of ideas in which we are just neutral arbiters, the people in the media, we just manage traffic, is completely delusional, because we in the media have our own ideologies and our own prejudices, and we exist in an extremely ideological scenario. But because, like you say, it has existed for so long and it is so widespread and ubiquitous, you don't see it. It's like the air, right? So we don't question the fact that we are, overwhelmingly right of center, right? We are overwhelmingly neoliberal. We are overwhelmingly supportive of capitalistic solutions. And we are overwhelmingly suspicious of solidarity and group activity because it is framed as vandalism. Sorry.
Exactly. No. I was going to ask you about in the free speech crisis chapter, you criticize free speech absolutism, let's say, in such a good way, and I was wondering if you want to tell a bit about that, because it is important in for American politics at this point of time. I think why free speech is not an absolute value, neither for America nor for anywhere in the world.
I mean, free speech has never been an absolute value. And this is what people are very dishonest about. You and I, right now, we are subject to free speech laws in the US. So if I libel you, then you can sue me, right? If I advertise and I don't declare that this is an advert, that is also breaking a free speech law. That's breaking a law, and I can be taken to court for it and made to declare it. We are subject to copyright law. I can't just republish your book in my name because that is an infringement of copyright law. We exist in a myriad of speech regulations all the time, but the media and the right has found it useful, the right and kind of supported by I call them useful idiots. The sort of,
yeah, I know many of them.
The Enlightenment liberals who are like, oh, I don't agree with you, but I support your right to say, well, I disagree with you, like all that kind of misattributed Voltaire nonsense. So the right and the media, supported by useful idiots, has somehow fixated on a very tiny definition. Actually defined it itself, and deluded us, created this myth that actually speech should be as absolute as possible. And it's only when Donald Trump is banned from Twitter that then we have this crisis of free speech. I'm like, you are protected every day by several free speech laws within the US Constitution. Like the First Amendment that people keep referring to all the time is actually modulated by a bunch of other laws that people don't talk about because they serve everybody, right? No one wants to throw away Bible laws. Well, some people do, but it's not a popular cause. Nobody wants to throw away copyright laws, right? Because it's about money. So it's only when we come to these very abstract definitions of free speech that become about allowing racists, sexists, Holocaust deniers, Islamophobes to speak without getting any kind of blowback, then suddenly we become very precious about free speech. And I'm like, well, you either have to be precious about free speech full stop and throw the whole thing out, or understand that as a society, a liberal society is about finding a balance between individual freedom and group benefit. And we do that all the time. So we're getting
I was going to ask you a little bit realpolitik question. Trump is over, but you and I, we know that it's not over when Trump is over. The followers of, as I call them, minions of Trump's are there, and they're looking for a new, I don't know, Führer, I would say. Right. But still, Biden took over. The other day, in an event, somebody asked me this question, so I'm going to ask the question to you. Are you hopeful?
Oh,
yeah, I know.
I am hopeful in the long term, but not very much in the short term. And I'll explain why. I'm hopeful in the long term because there are trends that are irreversible that I'm beginning to see, right? I think Black Lives Matter was something that actually extended beyond its race-related goals. Black Lives Matter.
Absolutely.
I think people don't quite understand yet what a big deal it was. Apart from you, who say in your book what a big deal it was. And that it was a sort of interlocking global solidarity, like a spontaneous global movement that was cross-race, cross-demography. I know it sounds quite trite, but mostly set up and kept going by young people, so people in their 20s and their 30s. And what they do is what you talk about, which is they replace anger with attention. So even though, this is really interesting, this is so interesting, like people who have tuned in, if you can find, it's in my book, but if you can go and look this up, it's really, really fascinating. So what we have, the media narrative about Black Lives Matter is that it is disruptive, that it creates more race discord, that it is a vandal movement, that it's looting, blah, blah, all these terrible things that we've heard about Black Lives Matter. What you don't know about Black Lives Matter is that the funding that was raised in the US went towards voter registration, right, to enfranchise marginalized people. It went to funding defense pots, people that could have access to legal aid. It went to domestic violence charities. The same happened in the UK. So while the media was like going on about what a terrible destructive movement this was, laws were being changed, curriculums and syllabuses are being reappraised. And the money that was raised is going to where people know that they need to pay attention to, bringing in the margins more towards the center. And that sort of, that dichotomy, the sort of myth that we see, but the actual movement happening underground makes me feel quite hopeful, because I think people get it now. People are like, you know what, let them crack on, as we say in the UK, with it, but we are going to do what we can do on the community level, and that makes me quite hopeful.
It's not a topic that we should discuss in this conversation, but I really want to say that it feels hard for people like me, because in our earlier conversation yesterday, the day before, you told me we women of color, and I said, oh, I'm a woman of color now, good. Because I thought myself as a white person. No, I'm like, who is white? You see, there are 50 shades of white. At some point I was planning to write an article about that during Black Lives Matter, when the things were happening, and I thought, no, maybe shut up now for a while. But yeah, I'm like, who is white? Like, I'm coming from Turkey, and are Turkish people white, or Middle Eastern white? Anyway, but this is a good topic to talk about, because we don't feel white, but we are considered white sometimes, and so on. Okay, let's. No,
but before you go, what do you? How are you hopeful?
No, I'm not. But that doesn't change my stance, let's say, in life, because we're going through a very hard time, and hope is too fragile a word to hold on to. Yeah. So I'd better choose the word determination, because I do know that creating beauty is inherent in humankind. Yeah. Wherever or whoever they are, there is an inherent inclination. So I trust in that, and even there is no hope, people will thrive, because we're living in a time, things are happening so fast, and we always tend to understand humankind and history in the scope of our lives, whereas it's too long. Human history is too long. Things happened, and that we still survive. So I do think that, like, we are subjected too much of evil. The worst of our kind is too present. They're too present. They're too visible. So we started thinking that we are, in essence, evil. We don't even worth surviving, or we don't even worth, protecting. Do you remember during the pandemic, there was this frenzy of posting footages from around the world? Everywhere there were lockdowns, and the animals were taking over the cities, and people were posting this with a strange enthusiasm. It was as if they're seeing the world without the humankind, and in a quite frightening way, they liked what they saw. So the world without human looked beautiful to them, and I thought, okay, this was the first spring without the human audience, obviously. And humankind liked its absence. This is not good. I think this is where we are. We fucked up the planet. We fucked up the political system. We fucked up everything. And I think the young generation are seriously considering, maybe it's better we don't even exist. So this is what I am writing against, what I am trying to convince people for. No, we are not that bad. We can be good. And, thinking that humankind is evil in its essence is a fascistic idea. Whereas, if we can build up upon the assumption of good, that we are good, we can do more. I sound like self-help book sometimes.
I think your point about visibility is really important, about like how evil is visible, or more visible than it was in the past, and how anger is commodified. And this is one of the things that actually has made me hopeful in writing this book, even though I came to it from a position of sort of urgent alertness and like urgent awareness raising, it made me realize that actually there are so many more people who are in the same position, but because they are locked out of the mainstream, they are pushed to the margins by unreliable narrators in the media, by corporate interests in the city, by publishing industries, you know, by academic institutions. They think that they don't exist. And one thing we did see last summer, and one thing bizarrely we did see in lockdown, is that actually there is this huge lattice. It just needs to connect somehow. But because social media and the way the kind of the margins are set up against the center, the way that is set up is to kind of foreground and amplify the powerful, the angry, the photogenic, the kind of the newsy. And actually there is a lot of, you know, quiet, determined dignity and intelligence and attention that is being paid. And that's the note I end my book on, where I just think,
yeah, you know, I want you to read the last sentence.
You read your last line, and then I'll read it, and then we'll go to the question. Actually, if you can read both, that would be great, because you have it right in front of you.
Yeah. The thing is, I wrote Together. I mean, the name of the book is Together because of that. To be completely honest, I'm not interested in having a dialogue with the Trumpeteers or, you know, whatever, Brexiteers. I'm interested in a dialogue with people like me, because the algorithm of life does not allow us to meet. So we have to be together. Okay. So I'm reading you first.
Okay.
And then me. All right. So you don't have your book.
I don't have my book. I mean, I have it on a soft copy, but it's not as fun to read a hard copy. Sing it.
Well, all right. Okay, this is good because it starts with we. We will get there. We will get there. It will not be easy, and it will not happen overnight. But one thing is certain, as far as the keepers of the status quo are concerned, it's already too late. They will be hearing from us. Nice.
So I basically wrote a threat.
No, I don't hear it like that. I hear like we're winning. My last sentence is, I believe in you, you were, you are, and we will together be. Et voilà. I think they speak to each other.
It's just so fun. And this is, we'll do it. I'll do a brief love-in before we get to the questions. You know, we have never met, we have never spoken, you know, before last week. And so finding this book and reading your thoughts was very validating of my last.
I lost you. Do you hear me? You hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, I think it's my internet.
Shall we get to questions while your internet is leaving?
Yeah. Please do. Do you want to read it?
Oh yeah, I'll read from the bottom up. So it's once someone says it's frightening for the younger generation. Do you see it getting worse before it gets better? How do we equip our children to be ready for that?
There's a bit in my book. I'm sorry, I have to say this. There's a little story in my book about the little black fish. The ending of the story is actually not good, but my mother read to me in a different way. The good ending of the story was that the little black fish gets together with other little fish, and they organize, and they, you know, they survive. And then she gets back home, and then she tells stories and so on. And then I learned that actually it's not the ending of the story. The real ending is she gets, you know, nobody hears from her anymore. But then I told the same ending. I told the story to a girl. I read the story, and I changed the ending as well. So I think this is how we get our children prepared, by making them learn that there is another reality that we actually can create.
Yeah, and I think it's also another, my answer would be another version of the hope that I have, which is actively seek out people like you, you know, actively seek out people who are good for your children, actively seek out other children who are in the same position. And I think one thing that we have sort of been gaslit into believing is that bubbles are bad. People being like, get out of your bubble, you know, listen to opposing people's point of view. No, get into your bubble, make a bigger bubble, basically expand your bubble as much as possible with your own people, because one of the things that makes the younger generation feel hopeless is when they feel besieged. And that sense of siege is a false one. It's created by this sort of monopoly of the center against the periphery by, you know, all the things that we said. So someone else says, I'm always amazed when I step back and realize that all of these systems were created. It doesn't have to be this way. Curious to hear your vision for the future that involves new systems. Who do you see being the generators of those new systems, countries or people? Well, I don't see it being countries, but what do you think, actually?
Well, it's certainly people, but they're living in countries still. Okay, this is a chapter in my book called "Choose Reek over the Wreck." Reef over the wreck. I do think that the new politics is already forming, and there are new political organisms, and they formed since the Seattle happened, and then they formed in, you know, Occupy movements, in Tahrir, in Gezi uprising, in Black Lives Matter, and so on. And these new political organisms will take over the wreck of political institutions that we are, you know, using today, like especially local politics. I think the world will change through local politics. And we're going to see this happening especially in Western countries, or not only in Western countries, but we're going to see this happening in coming 5 years, I think, because it's already started. But yeah, people, not countries.
There have been a lot of new laws being passed in the US against protesters. Has this trend been happening around the world as well? Yes, it has. And it's been so interesting. So one of the things that I spend a lot of time on in general, as a columnist, but in particular in the book, is to sort of trace the response to the protests of the summer last year. And that there is as much to learn from the response as there is from the protests, because the way the establishment responded to these protests suggested that the establishment could tell that this was something far more terrifying than just a race reckoning, right? And so in the UK, for example, the whole conversation went from race to history, because history is the UK's like little precious box that should never be opened, because it's like, you know, it's an imperialist country that has that is built on colonialism in the same way that the US is built on slavery, but the British don't like to talk about that. But the sort of Black Lives Matter movement in the UK became about history. It became about colonialism and imperialism, because that is the weak bit of the British establishment. It's the weak bit in its story, right? So like in the concept of we need new stories, I talk about like how we need to write new stories. And this was the strongest story that the British had been writing for years and years and years. And the protests of the summer of last year basically took a dagger to the heart of that story. So now in the UK, what they've done is they've passed laws not against, this is quite funny, they've passed laws not against, looting or vandalism or any of those things. They passed laws against statue, what's the word I'm looking for? Defacement, right? So if you write something on a Churchill statue of Winston Churchill in the UK, you'll get a pretty hefty sentence. And they've slid that under the rubric of maintaining and protecting like Britain's listed buildings or something. So what was really interesting was, even though it was a big blow to the sort of cultural power of the protests in the UK, but it was such a good insight into the fear and the threat and the sort of earthquake that was beginning to happen at the base of British society. And so this is where I'm like very Pollyanna hopeful, in that when I see such aggressive responses to protest movements, I'm like, oh, you're frit now, you're scared, because you realize that this has the power to extend far beyond the little ghetto of police brutality or, race-related violence, whatever. You realize this is about, rebalancing history. This is about cultural power. This is about voter enfranchisement. This is about doubting and basically refuting these stories in public. And the last chapter of my book talks about how it's so easy. Like once these stories are launched, it's like a mirage. They just disappear. And you think, but it was so powerful. And because it has the power of the state, right? The state has the power to write curriculums, to run the media, to tell you what its history is. But once it's called out in public by a large group of people, it becomes very hard to unwind that. So yes, the answer to your question is yes, there have been lots of laws against protesters, but I think that's a good thing because it is an insight into how rattled the center is becoming by the margins encroaching on it.
Yeah, people for thousands of years killed each other because of stories. There's another story to be refuted. It's not easy for them. They're going to tell their children that their ancestors, thrived on slavery and so on. So it's not going to be easy. Nesrine, I loved talking to you, and we have to, repeat this with a drink at some point. I'm going to show your book again, the cover.
And then show your books. I don't have a hard copy. I don't have a hard copy of yours.
You don't? Okay, this is my very yellow book called Together, 10 Choices for the Better Now. So I hope you take both of them and read these two books next to each other, because it would make a good conversation, right, Nesrine? What do you think?
It definitely would. And I would urge you also to accept our testimony as outsiders about the worlds that we are not part of, but that we see better because we are not compromised by the networks that other people exist in.
My hometown is Izmir, and it is a part of the ancient Greek civilization. And in Athens, there was a tradition listening to outsiders to get a full picture of their own reality. So since ancient Greeks knew everything, they should know about this as well. So listen to us. You'll be hearing from us. As Nesrine says. Thank you, Nesrine. It was amazing to talk to you. And thank you for writing this book.
A pleasure and a privilege. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, and on behalf of Town Hall, I want to thank you both also for today's talk. We long for clear-eyed thinking, and I feel like we've certainly gotten that from you. So thank you so much for your insights and for your work. Thank you for being women in journalism, thinking about politics. It's so refreshing to hear your thoughts. And I want to thank the audience as well. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I want to encourage you to purchase copies of Nesrine's and Ece's book. They're both linked in the chat, so use those links to buy those today. I hope that you both stay safe in the coming months. I hope that your book tours go really well. And thank you again so much for being here today.
Thank you, Candace. Thank you. Kisses from Zach.